The marble headstone was cold beneath Margaret Chen's fingertips, just like it had been every Sunday for the past 12 years. Rain mixed with tears on her cheeks as she knelt in the manicured cemetery, her $1,000 coat soaking up mud she didn't notice. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she whispered to the engraved name. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you needed me most." She had built an empire, Chen Technologies, now employed over 15,000 people, but what did any of it matter? The guilt was a living thing inside her chest, growing heavier with each passing year. Her mother had died alone in a hospital bed while Margaret was closing a deal in Singapore. By the time she'd landed, it was too late. Too late for goodbyes, too late for forgiveness, too late for everything. Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her knees with trembling hands, and walked back toward her Mercedes. The cemetery bordered one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, a detail her driver always mentioned with concern. But Margaret didn't care about safety or appearances anymore. Nothing really mattered beyond this weekly ritual of grief and regret. Miss, please wait!" The voice was hoarse, desperate. Margaret turned to see a woman running toward her, thin, weathered, wrapped in layers of ragged clothing despite the spring warmth. Her hair was matted, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping on concrete. A homeless woman. Margaret's assistant had warned her about people like this in the area, always looking for handouts. Margaret reached for her purse, ready to offer a few bills and move on. But the woman grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Your mother," the woman gasped, eyes wild and urgent. "Your mother is alive. I saw her in a nursing home." The world tilted. Margaret's purse dropped to the ground, spilling its contents across the wet pavement. "What did you say?" "Helen Chen. That's your mother's name, isn't it?" "I saw it on the headstone. But she's alive. I know because I've seen her. Fairview Nursing Home on Oakmont Street. She's there. She's really there." Margaret's voice came out as a broken whisper. "That's impossible. I buried her. I stood at her funeral." "You're confused, or this is some kind of sick scam?" But something in the woman's eyes held her frozen. Not greed, not manipulation, just absolute certainty. "I volunteer there sometimes," the woman continued, speaking rapidly as if afraid Margaret would flee. "They let me come in from the cold, give me soup in exchange for reading to the residents. 3 weeks ago, a new patient arrived. Helen Chen. She has Alzheimer's, barely speaks, but when she does, she talks about her daughter Margaret, about how her daughter is brilliant, how she's going to change the world, how she misses her so much." Margaret's legs wouldn't hold her. She sat down hard on a concrete bench, her mind racing. "This isn't possible." "There was a funeral, a death certificate. I saw her in the casket." She stopped. Had she? The funeral was a blur of sedatives and shock. Her assistant had handled most of the arrangements while she was flying back, and the casket had been closed. Something about the condition of the body, they'd said. "What nursing home?" Margaret heard herself ask. 20 minutes later, her Mercedes pulled up outside a squat, tired-looking building in a neighborhood Margaret had never visited. Fairview Nursing Home was painted a depressing shade of beige, its small windows like sad eyes. The homeless woman, she'd said her name was Rita, sat beside her in the back seat, still shivering despite the car's heat. "I need to pay you," Margaret said. "If this is real, if she's really—" "I don't want money," Rita interrupted quietly. "I want you to have your mother back. Nobody should live with that kind of pain if they don't have to." Inside, the nursing home smelled of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. A tired-looking nurse at the front desk glanced up, her expression shifting from boredom to surprise at the sight of Margaret's expensive clothes. "I'm looking for Helen Chen," Margaret managed to say, her voice barely steady. "I was told she's a patient here." The nurse's eyebrows rose. "Helen?" "Yes, she arrived a few weeks ago." "Are you family?" "I'm her daughter." Something flickered across the nurse's face. Confusion, maybe pity. "Room 147. Down the hall, last door on the right. But you should know she's not very responsive. The Alzheimer's is quite advanced." Margaret walked down the corridor as if moving through water. Each step took an eternity. Each breath felt like the first or the last. Rita stayed close beside her, a quiet presence. "Room 147. Margaret's hand trembled on the doorknob. The woman in the bed was thinner than Margaret remembered. Her hair completely white now instead of the gray-streaked black. But the curve of her cheek, the shape of her hands folded on the blanket, Margaret would know them anywhere. "Mom?" The word came out as a sob. The woman's eyes opened, unfocused and cloudy. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then something shifted in those dark eyes. A flicker of recognition that might have been real or might have been Margaret's desperate imagination. "Margaret? My little girl?" Margaret collapsed to her knees beside the bed, grasping her mother's frail hand. 12 years of grief poured out in broken gasps. "I thought you were dead. Mom, I thought I'd lost you. I've been visiting your grave every week. How is this possible?" Over the next hours, as Margaret held her mother's hand and Rita quietly fetched nurses and water and tissues, the story emerged in pieces. It came from medical records, from confused statements Helen made during lucid moments, from the assisted living facility that had previously housed her. 12 years ago, there had been a fire at the hospital, where Helen Chen was being treated for pneumonia. In the chaos and smoke, patients were evacuated. Helen, already confused from medication and fever, had wandered away. She was found days later by social services, unable to remember her name or address, the early stages of Alzheimer's already taking hold. She'd been placed in the system under a Jane Doe designation. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, a badly burned body had been misidentified as Helen Chen. In the confusion of the fire, with Helen's belongings found near the deceased woman, officials had made a terrible mistake. Margaret had been notified. A funeral had been arranged, and Helen had disappeared into the anonymous maze of state care facilities. It was only recently, when an alert social worker had run Helen's fingerprints through a new database, that the error was discovered. Helen Chen wasn't dead. She'd been alive this entire time, less than 30 miles from where her daughter grieved at an empty grave. "I dreamed about you," Helen whispered, her lucidity fading in and out like a weak radio signal. "Every night I dreamed my daughter would find me. You're so beautiful. You look so successful. Did you change the world like you wanted to?" Margaret pressed her mother's hand to her tear-stained face. "None of it matters, Mom. None of it matters without you." That night, Margaret arranged for her mother to be transferred to the finest memory care facility in the state. She hired around-the-clock nurses. She cleared her schedule, and she called Rita, who had slipped away during the reunion, and asked her to come to her office the next day. When Rita arrived, nervous and out of place among the gleaming chrome and glass, Margaret was waiting with her lawyer. "You gave me back my mother," Margaret said. "You could have walked past me in that cemetery. You could have stayed silent, but you cared enough about a stranger's pain to speak up. How can I ever repay that?" Rita shook her head. "I told you I don't want—" "I know. You don't want money. But I'm offering you something else. A job. Here. I need someone who sees people the way you do. Someone who notices, who cares, who acts. I want you to help me run a foundation I'm starting. For homeless services. For elderly care. For making sure no one else falls through the cracks like my mother did." Rita's eyes filled with tears. "I don't have any qualifications. I've been on the streets for 3 years. You have the most important qualification there is. You have humanity. The rest we can teach you." 6 months later, Margaret sat in her mother's room at the memory care facility, reading aloud from a book of poetry. Helen didn't always know who she was anymore, but sometimes in the golden afternoon light, she would smile and pat Margaret's hand and whisper, "My daughter. My brilliant daughter." And on those days, Margaret would think of Rita, now thriving in her new role, now housed and healthy, now helping others the way she'd helped Margaret. She would think about how close she'd come to never knowing this miracle, never having these precious moments. She would think about how the most valuable thing in her life had been returned to her not by wealth or power or connection, but by the simple kindness of a woman who had nothing, but chose to give everything that mattered. "I love you, Mom," Margaret whispered, knowing that whether Helen understood or not, she was finally, impossibly, blessedly here to say it, and this time she would never be too late again.